All right, so good afternoon. I'm Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of LACIS, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program, and it's my pleasure to give you the welcome and introduce our speakers today, they're gonna present a recent book that was just published, Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil after the Pink Tide. Our presenters are first Sean Mitchell, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of Peace and Conflict Studies at Rutgers University. Álvaro Jarrín is a professor, also Director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the Holy Cross College University. And Felina Enriquez, who's Assistant Professor here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She's in the Anthropology Department. The three presenters are either editors or authors of this book. So when the presentations end, anybody who want to ask a question can unmute your mic and ask the question, or put your question in chat, and I'll leave the floor to you. Welcome and thank you for being with us today.
So I guess that's me. Hi everybody, I'm Sean Mitchell. And first, thank you for that introduction and welcome, Alberto. Thank you, Sarah, Kata, Alvaro for being here, and Felina for putting this together, and also for contributing your work to the book. It was an exciting, long process for the four of us who edited this book and the many authors. So it's thrilling for it to be out. Let me share, I just have a few slides. Find it. All right, can everyone see that? And one note, actually, the title of the book changed, the prompting of the editor, which I'm glad for, and I think it doesn't have the "after the pink tide" in it that the title of this event does. So it's Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil, which I think, in retrospect, I'm glad that the editor made us get rid of the pink tide part, because who knows if we're after the pink tide? There may be, I mean, actually, why don't I start there? I didn't plan to talk about this, but this gives some context as I just talk about the book generally. And well, first, you can see the title of my chapter, which I will talk about. But I should start by talking about the book generally, kind of outlining the project. There's the book cover, and you see the pink tide part came out, but the pink tide part is important. This, of course, is the move to the left in many Latin American countries over the first decade and a half or so of this century, which got referred to widely, popularly in English at least, as pink. Because kind of light left tide. And when we conceived this book, it really seemed to be receding extremely dramatically in Brazil. In fact, that's where a lot of the motivation for this book came from. Brazil had looked in many ways like a left-wing success story. For much of the beginning of this century, of massive poverty reduction, growing role on the world stage. Many people remember the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, this block of so-called emerging economies. Just thinking about that term underlines how wildly differently a world we now live in many ways, a more frightening world than that one, where there was a certain kind of optimism, which very interestingly even kind of made it out of Brazil about the possibility. Brazil became really exemplary, I think, of this widely spread popular optimism of the possibility of massive poverty reduction in a vastly unequal country without major social conflict. And all of that seemed to begin to come apart. What we refer to in the introduction to the book as the Brazilian unraveling. In 2013 was the first signs really that were publicly acknowledged that all was not necessarily well, with massive protests, which began as protests about increases in transit fares, and were increasingly taken over by right-wing groups, including those in Brazilian mass media, and became focused on impeaching the left-wing Workers' Party president. This became part of a kind of political and economic unraveling of the seemingly successful redistributive social democratic project, which ended up resulting through a very, very complicated process in the election of the far right Jair Bolsonaro in the end of 2018. As many of you will know, and perhaps something we can talk about in the Q&A, Brazil has presidential elections coming up in October of this year, the end of Bolsonaro's term. So anyhow, there's a lot involved here. The people writing about it are, mostly political scientists, that tend to have a more kind of macro political focus, which is very, very important and certainly part of my work. But all the people who contributed to this book are ethnographers. We do, research on kind of intimate aspects of people's lives, hanging out with people, doing qualitative research, trying to understand what the world means to people through just participating in people's lives. And we really wanted to shed light on this massive and pivotal period of social and political and economic transformation in Brazil through this more kind of intimate, this more intimate scale. And the book has now been translated. We have recently all finished doing edits to the Portuguese version of our chapters, and should be out before the presidential election in Brazil, which is exciting. Hopefully this will be part of the Brazilian discussions. I didn't even plan to talk this much. I'm now like way into my presentation, which I won't properly get through, but I'll at least give you a hint of what my chapter in the book is about now, in order to maybe entice people to read the book, to read the chapter if you haven't already. One more word about the book, just to give you an overview. It is divided into sections. So the intimacy of power is the first section, corruption and crime, which my chapter appears in. I'll talk about it soon. Infrastructures of hope, and old challenges, new activism. So just kind of laying out these different ways in which the ethnographers in the book try to shed light on this really tumultuous and, again, I think pivotal period in Brazilian history. Although how pivotal, we'll see, soon. Just quickly about the elections that are coming up. For those of you who follow Brazilian politics will know all this, but I don't know how many people that is. The only two candidates who seem to have any reasonable chance, given the polls, the very consistent polls, of making it to the second round, right? Brazil has a runoff system of the election, being the two main candidates are Bolsonaro, the current far-right president, and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, universally known as Lula, the former left-wing president who left office in 2010 with a 80-something% approval rating, and then was imprisoned under what were really spurious and politically motivated charges in 2018, when he was front runner for the presidential election. He again is the front runner. Bolsonaro is second. All of the attempts to get another candidate, a so-called third way kind of centrist candidate, have really flopped, although there are many attempts. So it looks like this will be the nature of the election. And given the character of Bolsonaro's governments and the things he said, and his admiration for Trump and alliance with the military police in particular, there are real questions about whether there will be violence if Bolsonaro loses, whether the Bolsonaro government will accept the results. So it's a tumultuous election, but so the kind of events and the conflicts that we describe in this book are far from closed. The book takes a particular period in time, but these are complicated, ongoing processes. So real quick, now that I've used most of my time to talk briefly about my chapter, which, as I said, is called Cruel Pessimism, the Affect of Anti-Corruption and the End of the New Brazilian Middle Class. About how much more time do I have? Anyone keeping track? I don't know what time I started.
I mean, you can take another 5-7 minutes.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Thank you, Alberto. This comes from a project that I have been working on for a number of years, along with Ben Young, who's one of the editors of the book, and Charles Klein. Back in 2015, actually, we managed to get funding for something I had been planning to work on. And I ran into Ben, and it turned out he wanted to work on the same thing. So we decided to apply for funding together, and you invited Charles. And that was the so-called new middle class, right? The some 35 to 40 million Brazilians who at that time, when I was thinking about this project in 2014, 2013, had risen into this, supposed new middle class, right? Again, a period of massive and rare poverty reduction. And I had recently read Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which was a big sensation at the time. I don't know if you're not familiar with his arguments, but he very made the, very persuasive argument that under most circumstances in capitalism, inequality tends to increase. And the periods in which inequality decreases in capitalist economies are relatively rare over a long historical period. So I was like, wow, this is a really kind of fascinating and hopeful thing that's been going on in Brazil. Let me study it. And by the time we got funding, everything began to collapse in different ways. So the stuff I'm writing about now, that Ben is writing about now, is really about the dissolution, the sad dissolution of that project in many ways. I think I have a couple slides here to give you a sense. Yeah, here you have a sense from 2003 to 2005, just the extent to which this C class, which became referred to as the new Brazilian middle class, grew, as did the kind of A and B, the upper class categories in Brazil also grew, and these poorer categories of Brazil shrunk significantly. Now, this middle class was not a middle class by most conventional standards. At the low end, depending on how you reckon the exchange rate, we're looking at a couple $100 a month per person. The low end of this so-called new middle class. So these are, still people who struggled in significant ways, but it really was a significant period of poverty reduction, and which is really over, right? Brazil, had been taken by the United Nations from its map of hunger in 2013, but according to a study from a few months ago, now something like 9% of the Brazilian population are in a real state of hunger. So it's a absolutely kind of tragic reversal of these happier trends of that period. I won't, because I don't know that much time, I won't show any more slides. And just to briefly tell you about the argument that I make in the chapter. Actually, one more thing about a lot of the chapters, which was very, very interesting. When we sent out a call for chapters by ethnographers about this period, there are a lot of people thinking about affect, forms of emotion that are shared, and often very depressing forms of affect. And I found that notable. My paper, I haven't usually in my work written about emotion and affect, but I was moved to because of what I encountered in doing research with these new middle class people straddling the poverty line over this these last bunch of years in Brazil, during this transformational period. And I encountered frequently what I ended up calling an affect of cruel pessimism. And in coining that term, I'm borrowing from the late cultural theorist Lauren Berlant, who referred to cruel optimism in the United States, this kind of drive to always strive for things that end up making you worse off and less happy than you might have been. And so kind of riffing on Berlant's work, I thought of, this kind of affect I'd been experiencing as a kind of cruel pessimism. And what I understand the cruel pessimism to be is and I think this grew significantly during this period, right? After the optimistic years when Brazil seemed to be getting better, more powerful, more successful, less poor, I encountered this just pervasive sense that Brazil was doomed to failure because of the corrupt character of Brazilians themselves, right? And it's that notion that I refer to as cruel pessimism, and which I think was a very, very important condition of possibility for the election of Bolsonaro, right? So I recount my many discussions with one person whose economic trajectory really mirrored that of this new middle class, precipitous rise, precipitous decline, along with many people in her class, who, by the end of this period, shortly before the election of Bolsonaro, was saying things like the only thing that can fix Brazil is being struck by a meteor shower. And sure enough, Bolsonaro in his campaign was promising to wipe the slate with violence, with the kind of violence of a meteor shower. So I think this particular affective condition made many people who were Workers' Party voters, who were, enthusiastic about kind of social democratic project for Brazil, receptive to this, this message of violence that was key to Bolsonaro's election. So through the ethnographic work, the chapter really charts that. The one other thing I'll say, and again, I went totally off script because I spoke so much about the book. So this is just, I hope it's clear to everyone. But the one other thing I'll say is and I do talk about this in the paper, but more so in other work I'm doing, the production of this affect of cruel pessimism is something that happened through a historical process. And the discourse of corruption as it emerged in Brazil, I think partially really emerged through the very, very cynical use of corruption as a weapon, of a kind of lawfare against the Workers' Party, by the so-called Lava Jato team, the group who were involved in the impeachment of PT President in 2016, the arrest of Lula in 2018. And there have been many transcripts of their conversations on social media that were leaked and reported on. And they really showed the extent to which the so-called anti-corruption campaign was itself a very cynical and politicized and often operating illegally kind of operation. So all of this contributed to this affective cruel pessimism, which itself was an important condition for the election of Bolsonaro. And that, with lots of ethnographic detail, is in a nutshell the argument that I make in my chapter. And I hope some of you read it and would love to talk more during the Q&A, but I won't take up any more time. So thanks.
Thank you, Sean. I'll go next. So let me just, so I can, okay. So nice to meet you all. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at College of the Holy Cross, another of the co-editors of this volume. And yeah, we were all very interested in emotion, right? So how emotions shaped how people voted, how people felt hopeless about Brazil when they had been very hopeful before. We saw this very sharp shift in emotions, which ended up leading to very sharp political changes, right? That's one of the arguments that we make. And any election in a country as big as Brazil is very complex. There's no one reason why Bolsonaro won. The different chapters give different reasons why different populations voted for him. But I focus a lot on sort of the gender politics of that Bolsonaro put forward, right? What I call the politics of disgust, and how gender nonconforming activists respond to that. So Jair Bolsonaro rose to power through homophobia and transphobia. That was one of the central things that he used to gain power. For nearly a decade before he was elected, he was already talking about gay people, trans people as being dangerous to the nation, right? For example, he made this claim that LGBT educational materials that the Workers' Party was trying to implement were very dangerous because they, quote, incentivize homosexualism and promiscuity and, quote, made children easy targets for pedophiles, right? And we're seeing similar tactics being used against trans people in the United States. So it's kind of interesting. And he always talked about gender ideology as this very dangerous, right, import from outside, according to him, that was destroying the nation. And it made him very popular among the Christian right. Deploying this discourse is one of the main reasons why a lot of evangelical pastors and evangelical congressmen support him and why evangelical people voted for him in large numbers. On top of his discourse, right, which was, again, not accurate, right, the educational materials that he accused the Workers' Party of implementing, particularly Fernando Haddad, that was his main rival in the presidential election. On top of that, there was a lot of fake news circulating on Brazilian social media, in part made possible by supporters of Bolsonaro that sort of spread this news on social media, particularly the WhatsApp messaging app. Just to give you two quick examples, there's dozens I could give you. They began saying that Workers' Party, the PT, was distributing erotic baby bottles in kindergartens, that they were replacing a normal teat in a baby bottle with one shaped like a penis, right? Completely fake, but it went super viral, and a lot of people bought this idea that the Workers' Party was sexualizing children. Another weird fake news circulating in Brazil was that Pablo Vittar, which is the most famous drag queen in Brazil, like she has millions of followers, was going to be put in the 50 reais bill, right? That she was going to replace like a national figure. So there was this sense that the state had been sort of captured by LGBT interests, right? And of course, there had been very important gains for LGBT rights during the Workers' Party because they were in dialogue with those social movements, right? But Bolsonaro and the fake news surrounding this election really made it seem like there was this very dangerous thing that was happening, right? Since Bolsonaro got elected, things have just gotten pretty bad for LGBT people, right? He completely erased LGBT rights from government programs. It's like LGBT people no longer exist, right? There was a strong LGBT component, right? So if LGBT rights were central to the government programs of the Workers' Party, that's no longer the case. He appointed an evangelical pastor, Damaris Alves, as the head of a new ministry of the family that he created. She famously declared that when she took power, right, in the ministry, she said that a new era would begin in Brazil where boys would wear blue and girls would wear pink, right? A return to traditional gender norms was sort of her main message. And she has also kept up with this notion that, right, there's all these horrible things happening, gender's falling apart, we need to rescue it, right? It's kind of one of her main discourses that she puts forward. During the COVID-19 pandemic, another example, Bolsonaro claimed that the vaccine could make women grow beards and could give people HIV/AIDS, right? Again, completely false. He was very openly anti-vaccine. But it's interesting that he was using this gender panic, right? This kind of very false idea of what LGBT rights are about in order to push forward his own agenda, right? Whenever he's like, it's his go-to place because he knows it works, right? It's a panic that works. So when I analyze Bolsonaro, what I call a politics of disgust, some people have also called it a politics of hate. He's portraying LGBT minorities as a threat to the nation, to the very fabric of the nation, right? In order to win elections and get more support from the Christian right. And I argue that it targets viewers on a very visceral, non-rational level, which is why it works, right? It sort of makes people panic about their children being sort of, right, victims of pedophiles in schools, right? There's this very intense fear that is cultivated by a politics of disgust, right? Sian Guy, a theorist of affect, argues that disgust is so important to the political right because it always reinforces boundaries between yourself and these contaminating others, right? These dangerous others that are somehow threatening your body politic or your nation. So gender nonconforming activists from interlocutors in Sao Paulo realized a long time ago that trying to have a logical argument, right, about sort of like all these things is very difficult. It's almost useless unless you're able to use affect and emotion in return, right? If you're trying to rewire how people respond emotionally to these kind of fake news and these kind of political claims, and really try to make them think differently and feel differently about LGBT minorities, right? Particularly trans minorities that are particularly at risk and vulnerable in Brazil. So there are many things they do, right? Some of the activists just have embraced the call to actually become politicians, do politics. So at the same time that Brazil elected Jair Bolsonaro, Sao Paulo elected Erika Malundinho and Erika Hilton, two important positions in the Sao Paulo legislature. Later on, Erika Hilton became a city councilor of Sao Paulo, which is a vereadora, which is a very powerful position in the city of Sao Paulo. Both openly Black trans women are very proudly talk about trans issues, but not about that. It's what I love about them is how they're always talking about intersectional politics, about race, class, gender discrimination. How do we do this together? And they belong to the Socialist Party of Brazil. Another quick example of the artivism, they call it artivism because sometimes they mix art with activism. It's very common. I remember watching a play called the As Três Olhares de Sao Paulo City, or the Three Sirens of Sao Paulo City, a play that remembers the transphobic police violence during the dictatorship, but specifically ties it to the present, right? Sort of argues there's a connection between the violence back then and the violence today that we see with Bolsonaro. And the play's excellent at humanizing travesti lives, right? So travesti people are people that are gender non-conforming. Transgender identity is very specific to Brazil. And usually they have to resort to sex work in order to make a living because there's so very few job opportunities for them, although that is changing. And what they do is what the play does is it really helps humanize those lives, help us think from their point of view and why the police violence was so terrible. And argue for how to rewire, right? It's sort of the play itself helped to rewire the audience's emotions in relation to travestis by asking at one point in the play for us to participate in a protest against police violence. So people literally are asked to join the play itself with sort of banners. So it was kind of a pedagogical moment that I found really interesting as a form of activism, sort of teaching you to do activism. They also are very good at reclaiming Christian symbols. So Viviane de Leboni, for example, is a trans woman who famously crucified herself during a pride parade in order to call out violence against trans women. And more recently, Renata Carvalho put a play called Jesus Christ, Queen of Heaven, which thinks, what if when Jesus came back in the second coming, he came back not as a he, but as a she, as a travesti in particular, as sort of the most vulnerable position in Brazil. It's a fascinating play. Renata Carvalho really does a great effort into sort of humanizing what a travesti life is like, right? And why, if Jesus was for the downtrodden, why Jesus would be for travestis. And the play was, of course, protested. It was very controversial, but at the same time, Renata Carvalho argues it allowed her to sort of have dialogues with pastors and try to get them to see her point of view. And Viviane de Leboni has a similar take on the reactions to her performance. Renata Carvalho always talks about humanizing and naturalizing trans bodies. I won't read the entire quote, but the part that is in bold, she said, we need to humanize and naturalize the trans body, and we can only accomplish that if we become familiar with it in order to raise all labels and stigmas and criminalization it suffers. And affect theories talk about this, talk about how Sarah Ahmed, who is a famous affect theorist, says that disgust is all about like coming into contact with something and then rejecting it, pushing it away, right? Sort of having this reaction of disgust. But she says there's always a moment of possibility before you let the disgust take over you, where you actually learn something about that other, that contaminating other that you find disgusting, right? So I think a lot of the art that trans activists and travesti activists do in Brazil really tries to get people to lessen their disgust by just becoming familiar with trans people and trans issues. They're amazing at using social media to sort of talk about trans issues. Erika Malonguinho, for example, posted this powerful image on the left about Demetrio Campos, a trans man who committed suicide, and a young Black boy, Joao Pedro Matos, who was killed by police one day apart in Sao Paulo. And she sort of wrote this amazing narrative about how sort of anti-Black violence is very much part of Brazilian daily life and how we have to counter it. As a politician, it was powerful that she was saying this, right? On the right, we have an image from the Transgender Day of Visibility in January, made by a group of trans men in Brazil, where they put a picture of a torso of a trans man that has had a mastectomy, right, has had top surgery. And it says, we're proud of our bodies, we're proud of our history. This is not polemical, we just want to be happy. And accompanying that powerful image, the statement that this organization said, affection is now one of our demands, affecting others and being affected is one of our objectives. We are studying how we can relearn how to see, how to listen, and how to speak. Lack of affection is a very cruel attempt against our lives, and that is why we feel the necessity to make this campaign. So I want you to notice how they talk about affect and emotion, right? Sort of loving people for who they are as a central aspect of their activism, right? So they're not talking about like, you need to have all the facts about trans people, rather you need to love trans people, trans men in particular, right? If you want them to not be suffering violence. The music scene is amazing. I highly recommend checking out some of the musicians that are coming out of this activist movement. Urias, for example, has a song called Diaba or She Devil, where she specifically talks about how your law made me illegal, you call me dirty, crazy, immoral, without meaning to be rude, fuck your beliefs. Right? So she's very in your face, and she talks about, again, sort of being in a position of abject, right? An abject position, being diminished by society, but how she responds to that, right? How she doesn't fall for that. And you want to call me She Devil, I'm going to embrace that in some ways, right? Blaspheme by Linda Quebrada, perhaps the most famous trans musician, travesti musician in Brazil, is constantly talking about loving travesti women for who they are. I applaud the travestis who struggle to exist and every day conquer the right to live and shine, right? So she's also she calls herself a gender terrorist, and she's always pushing the boundaries of activism through music. And just to end, right, so Linda, when Bolsonaro got elected, the day after, Linda Quebrada, she's a very inspirational speaker on top of being a great musician. She posted this, which I thought was very telling. You know, she said, now is not the moment to be fearful, much less to retreat. They are the ones who are fearful in the face of all our victories and advances. I would also be afraid if I were in their place, and that is why I cannot let go of all that we have achieved until now, and I ask that you join me in this battle. We are Black, trans, lesbians, women, and our workers, and this was never about them, this is about us. So she talks about intersectionality, right? We need to come together as all these different identities to fight back. But she also has this powerful message about, this is just a backlash. This is a very strong backlash against our advances, and we can't give up. We can't let this sort of destroy us, undermine us, but we need to stay hopeful. So they have very interesting messages about, even in all the hopelessness that Sean was talking about, I'm impressed by the amount of hopefulness that is very present in trans activism in Brazil. But I'll stop talking there, so we have enough time to chat, and so Felina can present the work.
Thank you, Alvaro, and thank you, Sean, for joining us today. Sean, thank you too for sort of throwing yourself upon the sword and giving a nice overview of the book. I think that was really helpful. I almost thought to email you all about it, and then it sort of slipped my mind. But I hope that it's enticed people to check out the book. I also want to thank Gata and Alberto and Sarah for their help in putting this together. So I will share my screen now. Okay. So I'm going to do a more kind of traditional conference style presentation that gives you an excerpt or sort of composite of my chapter in the book. And this is a really different example, right? The people that I'm working with, and the last time I was in Recife was in 2018, right before the election was happening. So I was seeing kind of the anxieties that were surfacing as people were facing more precarity and the prospect of perhaps Lula losing, when at the time, you know, Lula was already starting to be a non-starter essentially, and Bolsonaro was becoming more of a possibility. So people were kind of anxious about it. So in 2011 in Recife, Pernambuco, professional middle-class musicians who were part of the area's alternative scene were struggling to make ends meet. Independently produced bands like A Roda blended genres like rock and Afrobeat with elements of traditional folk music. Although A Roda had recently released a new album, it wasn't audible on mainstream national media. Nonetheless, at the time, state sponsorship in the form of public music festivals and grants provided a platform for the band to think big. When I asked them about the near future, they envisioned performing on bigger stages with more professional accoutrement, such as sophisticated lighting designs. And when I asked them as well, they also intended to tour the country and to international destinations like Argentina and the US, and their expectations coincided with those of their peers in the scene, and they dovetailed with a general sense that Brazil was ascendant, which Sean talked to us about. Bands like A Roda benefited from sponsorship at federal and local levels during the 2000s and the early 2010s. And this sponsorship focused on expanding cultural rights via multiculturalism. And sponsorship and new bureaucratic mechanisms that incentivize entrepreneurship enabled musicians to formalize their labor. Alternative scene musicians took advantage of these resources to enhance their images as respectable professionals, a status that historically was unavailable to most Brazilian musicians and typically reserved for more white-collar workers. Since 2013, however, Recife's alternative musicians have been contending with shifts that have pushed them to recalibrate their aspirations. In recent years, Recifenses have faced the biggest economic decline in Pernambuco in 2 decades and the sharpest decrease in quality of life in the country. These declines prompted significant cuts to the state's budget. They also contributed to the state government's decision to shift away from multiculturalism and toward more intensely promoting entrepreneurship. There were new programs like the System of Cultural Incentives from 2017 that offer grants and loans to finance cultural projects. But these grants and loans provide seed money instead of full funding for most projects. So as elsewhere, these neoliberal policies coincide with incentivizing cultural workers to be more entrepreneurial and to develop private markets, but with less and without overburdening the state. In response to these changes, my interlocutors have been scaling down their approaches. So they perform at intimate bars and private homes more than at large festivals like they used to. They're also trying new strategies like crowdfunding to make ends meet. And as they pare down their professional activities, musicians aren't embracing, at least the ones that I'm working with, aren't embracing hopelessness or other kinds of cruel pessimism, as Sean talked about, that posit the country's ruin as inevitable. Instead, they're cultivating a sense of what I call tempered hope. And this tempered hope helps to buffer against precarity and the rise of right-wing movements. In 2018, and this was in February, Tulio from the post-rock band Kaluvi didn't express the optimism that A Roda's members had described 7 years earlier. Kaluvi's members were unsure if they could even continue as a band due to financial and emotional stresses they were facing. Similarly, in that same year, one musician I know said that his only hope at the moment was that Bolsonaro wouldn't be elected. Amid uncertainty then, music was helping my interlocutors build hope and foster collaborative relationships with each other and their audiences. The strategies and the subjectivities as well that my interlocutors have been cultivating suggest that the rise of precarity among members of the traditional Brazilian middle class is reshaping what it means to be middle class. Precarity, the conjuncture between unstable contract labor and a loss of state provisioning, as Clara Hahn defines it, is influencing my interlocutors' experiences and worldviews. In Brazil and elsewhere, precarity is no longer exclusive to working class poor populations. It's also part of middle class life. And in employing entrepreneurial strategies, Recife's alternative scene professionals aren't seeking to emulate traditional middle class white collar workers. Rather, their priorities lie in fulfilling their artistic passions and meeting their basic needs. Middle-class Brazilians have generally experienced this economic crisis as a loss of income and a decline in life chances. But my interlocutors don't necessarily understand the circumstances in terms of loss per se, but rather as a continuation of what they've always had to negotiate: scarcity and precariousness. In 2018, Eduardo, a former member of AHODA, wasn't anxious about the economic downturn. He differentiated himself from white-collar professionals who, as he said, are, quote, impatient with the crisis, end quote. Eduardo and his peers, in contrast, are used to periods of feast and famine. But reduced sponsorships and political instability have still made their lives more precarious. And most of the professionals that I'm talking about grew up in middle-class households with parents who worked as civil servants or business owners or teachers. And although most lack their parents' financial stability, they nonetheless benefit from socio-political networks and professional networks. So knowing the right people is especially useful for cultural promoters because they've historically learned to be cultural promoters informally through apprenticeships that they arrange usually through social contacts. So one example, Huchi, a cultural promoter, began her career in the mid-2000s by volunteering in small theatrical and film productions that were led by her friends and from her university as well. So friends that she met at university. And eventually she formed her own production company. So her social network was really key in professionalizing. Musicians also face pressure from friends and family to pursue more conventional and prestigious careers. So André, pictured here, AHODA's keyboardist, felt like his non-musician peers looked down on him because they didn't consider music to be a viable career. He said, quote, "In my generation, there's a bit of that prejudice. They ask, what else do you do besides music? As if it were a hobby. They treat you as if you were inferior," end quote. Relative to their parents and middle-class peers, then, my interlocutors have different standards about what constitutes a good life. Working in the alternative scene means eschewing some of the norms that encompass traditional middle-class life. It's a counterculture where it's acceptable for people to smoke marijuana, wear tattoos, and embrace LGBTQ+ identities and people. And these are practices that aren't uniformly accepted in the traditional middle class and are increasingly increasingly part of public debates in Brazil, as Alvaro has told us, and other chapters in the book also deal with. And sonically, the scene's countercultural values are reflected in and constructed through musical approaches that blend high and low styles and local and transnational genres. And they make music that, quote, the market doesn't see, as a promoter stated. And in so doing, alternative musicians attract audiences that ostensibly prioritize art over entertainment. And in rejecting these traditional middle-class expectations, alternative scene professionals tend to live modest lifestyles. So a promoter and videographer named Hugo splits an apartment with a roommate in a lower middle-class neighborhood. And when I asked him about his income, he commented, quote, "It's enough to survive, but for now, it's not enough cash to travel and have a really cushy life," end quote. People like Hugo then invest their income on equipment like computers and instruments rather than on travel or luxurious consumer goods that have been often the markers of a traditional middle-class lifestyle. Although alternative scene professionals worry about their finances, the joy that they get from their work keeps them motivated. Juliana Holanda, pictured here, a musician and producer, sees this enjoyment as a metric of success. As he said, quote, "Success is enjoyment, sucesso é curtir." This passion also fuels Carlota, who has worked as a stage manager and roadie for over 20 years. And for him, seeing a performance come together is the most satisfying part of his job. As he said, quote, "You put everything together and see everything working, the whole machinery working, the lights working, the guy singing, everything rolling, and you know that you helped all that happen," end quote. The passion that people that Carlota feel is palpable. Their eyes light up when they describe their latest ventures. However, such passion is also a normative expectation within the cultural economy. It drives workers to sacrifice their health and prioritize work over other obligations. Nevertheless, this passion helps musicians in Recife and elsewhere forge professional and social connections. In 2013, a group of musicians, 2015, a group of musicians, promoters, and artists were working at the Sixth Floor Collective, where they pooled their resources, collaborated on projects, and hosted performances. The collective isn't just about compensating for reduced state funding in a deficient private sector, but also about creating community. Mary, a core member of the collective, emphasized how their events foster sociability between artists and audiences. They enable people to not just watch a show, as she said, but to also enjoy the space, the people, to interact. Projects like the Sixth Floor Collective, however, aren't necessarily translating into political mobilization. Since musicians can often go months without earning anything, they frequently accept exploitative opportunities. And this financial instability makes it difficult to mobilize, as the musician I call Ricardo explained. Carlota also, who I just mentioned, identified the absence of a, quote, principle of collectivity, end quote, among music professionals as something that prevents them from fighting for equitable wages and more government support. Now, as sponsorship has contracted, more bands are also depending on crowdfunding, and this entails its own challenges, like the band Kaluvi has experienced. But at the same time, they've been able to forge more intimate connections with their collaborators and their fans. Kaluvi's members are younger than most of the music professionals I've mentioned so far. They formed the band as undergraduates in 2010 at the Federal University. And once they graduated and they could invest more in the band, the recession hit, right? So in 2017, they decided to use Catarse, which is one of Brazil's most popular crowdfunding sites, to finance their third album. And crowdfunding seemed like a better opportunity than sponsorship, in part because they were noticing that state institutions seemed less receptive at the time to non-traditional music like theirs, so like non-folkloric music. And also, unlike state funding, crowdfunding enabled them to make the audience part of bringing the album to fruition. As Tulio, pictured second from the right, explained, he wanted to, quote, involve people in our project. The crowdfunding campaign helped the band to become better acquainted with its audience. Project funders posted pictures of themselves on social media and with the new album and the merchandise they had received from contributing. One fan even sent Kaluvi a photo showing their tattoo of the new album's cover art on their arm. For Tulio, these interactions revealed that everyone felt like they were part of the album's construction. And you see the cover of the album there on the right. Kaluvi's crowdfunding campaign was successful, but they didn't earn any profits. These went toward paying their collaborators, like the album art designer, and the cost of manufacturing and shipping merchandise. Given his persistent lack of income, Basilio, the bassist, drew on his university degree in psychology to establish a private practice. But after 8 months, he was still having trouble recruiting patients and establishing a steady income. And in any case, Basilio's heart was in music, not psychology. So in 2018, he started playing in a pop rock cover band that performed at nightclubs and weddings. And even though this wasn't really his style, he knew that it would enable him to remain a musician and, quote, at least have something stable each month. Between 2011 and 2018, Recife's alternative scene professionals experienced significant changes. However, they haven't responded politically by turning to the right. Rather, they've maintained their mostly left-wing stances. Nonetheless, the precarity that they face and even more so now during the pandemic, has further weakened their ability to mobilize for more equitable working conditions. Measures like 2020's federal Lei Aldir Blanc and more local efforts have provided some financial support, but it's not enough to ameliorate the intersecting racial and class disparities that were already shaping Recife's music industry and which are now even more pronounced. And those with access to elite social networks, higher education, and financial resources are much better equipped to survive than those who lack these advantages. But as precarity becomes more embedded in their lives and in ours, I think we need to work together to build solidarity more across social divides, which is also something that musicians have been trying to do in these last years. Thank you.